As you write directives, you're going to see that there's some key building block concepts that you need to know, really the foundation of your knowledge that we can build upon. And we're going to talk about these building blocks here to wrap up this particular module. So when it comes to views and controllers, we're all used to writing templates, that would be our views, and then merging in data into those and binding using the scope. Well, in directives, we could do the same type of thing. We can write templates, and then we can merge those in with our scope, our data. Now, there may be cases in a directive where you do like we did in the Hello World directive, and we actually put in some HTML or some text. There may be other cases where there is no physical or hard-coded template per se. It's all dynamically generated with JavaScript. And you could do it both ways. It really depends. Now, if you're doing a more DOM-driven directive, you may actually just have all JavaScript potentially. If you're doing a data-driven directive, then you might actually have a template and you might have a controller in the directive that are going to be used to output the HTML that you want. So, and you can even merge those concepts together. So it really depends on what you're doing there. But the good news here is if you're new to custom directives, the concepts that you already know in Angular are going to carry over. A lot of people like to think that directives are this kind of big, hard thing. And in reality, they're not. You just need to know a few foundational concepts. So let's take a look. At the bottom of the directive stack, if you will, there's something called a compile provider, $compile. Now this might be something, unless you've looked into custom directives, that you've never seen before. In fact, you might say, wow, I didn't even know that was in AngularJS. Well, this is really the engine that's going to be kind of revving up and making our directives possible, so that we can put those into a view and render HTML. Now, part of the compile provider is something called a DDO, Directive Definition Object. I mentioned this a little bit earlier a few times in the module, but this is really an object literal that has some very specific properties that we'll be going through that discuss or tell the compile provider, hey, here's what I need. Here's my template. Here's my controller. Here's my DOM manipulation code, whatever it may be. That's what a directive definition object is, or I just call it a DDO. It's way too hard to say otherwise. Now, in that DDO, we can actually define a template. We actually saw this in the Hello World directive. And then, of course, we can even have scope. So the same type of scope that you've worked with can be used. And you're going to see we can inherit that down, or we can have what's called an isolate scope. And we'll be getting to that in the next module. Now, the compile provider is defined this way in the AngularJS documentation. It compiles an HTML string or DOM into a template and produces a template function. Now, let me stop there real quick. If you've ever used Handlebars or Mustache or any of the client-side template frameworks out there, that's the same thing they do. They take an HTML template, they compile it up into JavaScript, and basically it's just converting the HTML in a string into JavaScript. And then they give you back a function. Now, what we do with that function from there in those type of libraries is we take some data and we merge it in. Well, what we're going to be doing with the compile provider here, as we finish the sentence, is it says, which can then be used, so in other words, the template function can then be used to link scope and the template together. So if you've done Handlebars, you've created a function and then merged the data, or Mustache or the others out there. Now, with the DOM, and when it comes to directives in the DOM, it's very, very similar concept. The big kind of differentiator is you don't have to write the render code or the JavaScript that actually compiles the template, takes the data, and merges those two together like I showed a little bit earlier in this section. Directives, once you get all the little pieces in place in the DDO, they just kind of do that for you. So it's actually really nice. So that's what the compile provider actually does. It's the engine that takes an HTML template and is able to merge in the data and then output HTML. Now here's the basics of the compile process. First off, you typically are going to have a template. Now it's very possible the template's dynamically generated. You can do that with JavaScript, of course, in a directive. But let's say that we're doing very similar to our Hello World directive. And that template's going to be fed into this compile provider. Now that's done through that DDO that we just talked about. Now that's going to, behind the scenes, give us a template function. We can then take our data, our scope, merge it in, and then we'll get HTML out. And really, that's what's going on with directives. So that's why I keep mentioning some of these other frameworks or libraries, I should say, out there like Handlebars or Mustache or others, because they're doing a very similar thing as well. It's just that this is all hidden from us in directives. I mean, you could certainly get to this if you'd like, but in most directives, you don't need to. You just supply the template, you supply the scope, and it just kind of magically does a lot of the work for you. Now, when it comes to this DDO, Directive Definition Object, here's some of the key things that you can do. So the first one we've already seen in the Hello World directive is you can define a template for that directive. As mentioned, you don't have to though. You can also include DOM manipulation code, and that might involve generating new children, it might update a div, anything DOM related. You can also have controllers. I mentioned this with the data-driven directive category earlier. And this really can clean up things because you can write a directive that's really just a little mini view and a mini controller that are put together. You can have scope, just like we're used to in a controller and a view. And then you can define how the directive can be used, such as, is it an attribute? Is it an element? Can it be used as a comment? And then there's much more we're going to be covering. We can even embed other directives in our directive, for instance. So there's a lot more to it, but that's some of the key features that you'll find in a DDO. Now here's some of the main properties we're going to be talking about throughout the course. First off, the restrict property is a DDO property you can use to say, hey, I want this to be just an element. Has to be an element. Can't be an attribute, for instance. And I mentioned that by default, starting with 1.3, it's an attribute or an element just out of the box. You don't even have to put the restrict in order to do that. It just happens. But you might have a scenario, in fact, I've had a few scenarios, where I don't want to use it as an attribute, or I don't want anyone else to use it as an attribute. I just want to use it as an element. So we can use the restrict property for that. Now you've already seen the template property, and this is where we can give it just a literal string of a template. You can also use a template URL. Now, these can also be combined with what's called the template cache in AngularJS. So you could even embed templates in a script tag, a little bit of a special attribute you have to put on that to make it happen. But that way you don't have to download it and you don't have to hard code it into the directive. You could actually have it be external potentially. Now we have the scope, and this is the same scope you're used to with controllers. Although we're going to be talking about different ways you can set up the scope and kind of isolate it from the outside world. We can have a controller property, and this just does exactly what you'd expect. Just like in a AngularJS route, you can define a controller for a given view. We can also define a controller for a given directive. And then finally, we can have what's called a link function. Now, this will be really important for that kind of DOM manipulation type of directive I talked about, that category. The link function is all about the DOM. So where things get a little bit challenging, I think where people get confused with directives is they see, controller and template and link and scope and wonder when are they supposed to use one or the other. And I'm going to be breaking that down into pretty small digestible chunks as we go throughout the course. Now here's an example of using some of these DDO properties to wrap up here. So we have a very simple directive similar to our Hello World called myDirective. We now have the directive function, and you can see we're placing it inside a module called module name. Now we're going to have the DDO now be returned as an object literal. So earlier in the Hello World directive, we just did something like this template, except for we just had Hello World. But notice that I can restrict things. This means to an element or attribute. I can define a scope. In this case, this is called an isolate scope, and that'll be the subject of the next module. We can do templates, which are really just data binding expressions embedded in a view, very similar to a view that you're used to writing. We can embed controller functions, and then we can have this DOM type of function called a link function. This links our directive into the DOM, and you'll notice that we can get access to the scope, to the element where the directive is, and even to the attributes that might be on that particular element. So we'll be talking about each of these in much greater detail as we move along. But that's a quick introduction to some of the building blocks. So as a quick review, we have the compile provider. On top of that, it requires this DDO. The DDO has several properties such as these that you see here, restrict and scope and template, and there's actually several others. And really what it's doing behind the scenes then is taking that template, taking the scope, and merging those together to output the HTML. And that's what happens behind the scenes and kind of the foundation that happens with directives.